I was interested when I was in Saudi Arabia that there's now a national debate there where they're aware that the Muslim world is kind of on fire and that they have an implication in this, and they kind of know it. They know that their very, very narrow and bitter interpretation is causing these explosions. Why is it that Yemen and Libya and Iraq and Syria, where things were pretty cool and pretty calm between different sorts of people until very recently, are now the world's worst examples of intercommunal, very un-Abrahamic, inhospitable fighting? Well, they're conscious of it. So I just want to leave you with a few thoughts. Here is, as part of the national debate that they're now having on television between sheikhs who are pro and anti the official Salafist line. So here is Sheikh Abdul Kalbani, who is from the establishment there and a former imam of the Haram in Mecca, talking about Daesh, which is the ISIS phenomenon in Syria, Iraq and elsewhere. He says, Daesh has adopted Salafist thought. It's not the Muslim Brotherhood's thought, Qutbism, Sufism or Asharite thought. They drew their ideas from what's written in our own books, from our own principles. The ideological origin is Salafism. They exploited our own principles that can be found in our own books. We follow the same thoughts but apply it in a refined way. This is a real crisis for them. The kingdom is kind of wobbly, and we should be praying for its stability, I think, because its collapse into sectarian chaos would be a disaster for the Ummah and for the Haramain. We should be praying for the kingdom's stability, evidently. But they're having this conversation at the moment, and I saw a television interview on Prince Walid's channel, Rotana, with one of the sheikhs, Sharif Al-Auni, where he's written publicly in Al-Hayat newspaper and other newspapers saying the reason why the old, inclusive, beautiful adab and good neighborliness between different communities of the Abrahamic world is now breaking down is because of certain ideas that are in the books of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab. You can see the interview on YouTube. It's kind of public knowledge. Everybody there is talking about it. He says their ideology comes from our ideology, and we need to think very carefully about what we're exporting. So I think that we need to take the views of those Saudi sheikhs seriously and to respect the public debate that they're now having. They can see that wherever that ideology is going, people shout more loudly into the microphones, people are angrier about their non-Muslim neighbors, people are angrier about other interpretations of Islam, and countries which need everybody to be good neighbors are now apparently irreparably broken and torn up, and we weep for Syria and Iraq, and those places are dear to our hearts, and to see them collapse in this kind of unnecessary sectarian hatred between people who should be Abrahamic brethren is very painful. But these sheikhs in Saudi Arabia are now saying these ideas, Salafist ideas, are an interpretation of our own books and our own ideas. And Sharif Al-Auni, I saw him on TV, says it's not coming from Sufism, it's not coming from Asharism, it's not coming from any other Islamic school of thought. Where this interpretation of Salafiyya takes root, in a country where people are ethnically diverse and the place has to be neighborly, it's sowing the seeds of a detonation. That's their view, and I suggest that we treat it with respect, and inshallah, because it's the land of the Haramain, we'll make dua that that debate is resolved in a positive way, and that the Muslims there and everywhere return to something that's more authentic, that we have the courage to overcome our narrow-mindedness and our desire to blame other members of the Abrahamic family and move back to something that is uncompromising and more true to the spirit of the Sunnah and to the mithaq of alastu bi rabbikum and to the way of Sayyidina Ibrahim Khalilullah alayhi wa ala nabiyyina as-salam. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to quench those fires and to calm the ummah and to make us once again visibly khayra ummatin ukhrijat lin-nas, the best ummah that is brought out for mankind. At the moment we're not visibly that, and the reason is very often, according to these Saudi sheikhs, the spread of those doctrines. So may Allah unite the Muslims and give us mutual respect, and inshallah bring us together as Ahl al-Qibla in everything that is good.
In this audio, I'm going to be talking about the definition of Salafi Jihadism. and the proponents of this ideology throughout history, I figure it is an important discussion to have regarding why we should be talking about this in the context of what I'm about, which is the events of September 11, 2001, and of course, the events relating to it pre and post. But Salafi jihadism is at the core of this event, as well as others. And it is used to demonize the Muslim Ummah, or the worldwide Muslim movement as a whole. And the blame for this is due to ignorance and, of course, the prejudicial legacy media. In regards to the context of this ideology, it is, of course, a small percentage compared to the large percentage of Muslims as a whole. And although this is primarily a Sunni problem because it is from the Sunni school of thought, the majority of the Sunni world condemns the ideology of Salafi jihadism, or as it used to be called, Wahhabism. I'm going to be talking about the definition of Salafi jihadism using multiple websites and from the texts in which I have read, as well as the three proponents of this ideology, which has been an influence for many of these terrorist organizations throughout history. Ibn Taymiyyah, Muhammad ibn al-Wahhab, and Sayyid Qutb. And the evolution of this ideology throughout history, which makes it from an apolitical to a political one. Salafi Jihadism is a transnational hybrid religious political ideology based on the Sunni sect of Islamism. Islamism being a political ideology which posits that modern states and regions should be reconstituted in constitutional, economic, and judicial terms in accordance with what is conceived as a revival or a return to authentic Islamic practice in its totality, which is seeking a global caliphate, or which is a concept of a single Islamic world government, advocacy for physical military jihadism, and Salafi concepts of returning to what adherents believe is to be the true Islam. The terms Salafi jihadist and jihadist-Salafism were coined by scholar Gilles Kepel in 2002 to describe a hybrid Islamist ideology developed by international Islamist volunteers in the Afghan anti-Soviet jihad, which have become isolated from their national and social class origins. The concept was described by Martin Kramer, who is an American scholar of the Middle East in Shalom College in Jerusalem, in which he says, will be inevitably simplified to jihadism, or the jihadist movement in popular usage. Qutbism has been used as a close relative or variety of Salafi jihadism. Practitioners are referred to as Salafi jihadis or Salafi jihadists. They are sometimes described as a variety of Salafi and sometimes as separate from good Salafis, whose movement eschews any political and organizational allegiances as potentially divisive for the Muslim community and a distraction from the study of religion. Traditional Salafi scholarships mostly denounce Salafi jihadism as a hybrid ideology, far removed from Salafi orthodoxy. Contemporary Salafi scholars such as Ibn Uthaymin, Ibn Baz, Salah al-Fawzan, and Muqbil ibn Hadi condemned rebellion against the rulers as the most corrupt of innovations, and forbade Muslims to take it upon himself to execute a ruling which is under the jurisdiction of the rulers, such as takfiris. Takfiris are people or Muslims who condemn other Muslims as being non-Muslim. Groups would be like from the Egyptian organizations such as Al-Jihad or the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, or Al-Qaeda, or in its current era, the Islamic State in Levant. According to Salafi Jihadists, they are not dividing the Muslim community because in their view, the rulers and other self-proclaimed Muslims they attack have deviated from Islam and are actually apostates. Or as I just said before, they're takfiris, judgments made upon Muslims such as the Shia, Sufi. In the 1990s, extremist jihadis of the Al-Gamma Islamiyya were active in the attacks on police, government officials, and tourists in Egypt. And the armed Islamic group of Algeria was a principal group in the Algerian Civil War, both events and groups I have covered extensively in videos and written works. The most infamous jihadist-Salafist attack is, of course, the September 11, 2001 attacks against the United States by Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. While Salafism had next to no presence in Europe in the mid-1980s, Salafist jihadists had, by the mid-2000s, acquired a burgeoning presence in Europe, having attempted more than 30 terrorist attacks among the European Union countries since 2001. Mainly groups like Al-Qaeda, Islamic State in Levant. While many see the influence and activities of Salafi jihadists as in decline after 2000, or at least in the United States, others see the movement as growing in the wake of the Arab Spring and the breakdown of state control in Libya and Syria, where we saw US coalition military intervention. And we also saw that in Iraq in the Second War in 2003, in which we saw the overturn of the Ba'athist regime, which gave rise to a civil war between the Shia and the Sunni, as Shia-led Maliki led the government, and a crackdown on the Sunni, in which created the vacuum for Al-Qaeda and later the Islamic State in Levant. The tenets or the differences from traditional Salafism is as follows. Even though, although Salafi jihadists profess to follow Salafism, they borrow heavily from Sayyid Qutb's concept of Jalaliya, or the pre-Islamic ignorance, Hakimiyya, or the sovereignty of God, and Takfir, which is excommunication. Prominent contemporary ideologues of Salafi jihadism, such as Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi, a very influential Islamist who's also a Jordanian Palestinian writer. He's a Qutbi jihadi ideologue, who has popularized many of the common theories of radical Islam today, and also is considered the primary influence on Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who later would create the al-Jihad group, which later became the Islamic State in Iraq, which later then became the Islamic State in the Levant. And also Abu Qatada al-Fastini, who is a Salafi cleric and Jordanian national, who was accused of having links to terrorist organizations and frequently imprisoned without charge at the United Kingdom, in which they drew heavily from the works of Sayyid Qutb and adopted concepts of al-Wala al-Walbana from the writings that he wrote. And Maqdisi's interpretation of Wala al-Walbana marked a distinct shift from traditional Salafi theology by introducing Takfiri principles to it, adopting a binary worldview. Maqdisi condemned contemporary Muslim governments as apostates and takfired the Muslims who supported them. To the present day, Maqdisi is considered the most dangerous Muslim of the last 25 years. Salafi jihadist doctrines advocating violent overthrow of the existing political order is seen as heretical by traditional Salafis. Salafi jihadists also reject democracy as it contradicts their interpretation of Hakimiyya. Mainstream Salafis, on the other hand, participate in democratic systems across the world, including the Muslim Brotherhood, whose ideology differs from, say, that of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, both Egyptian organizations. Salafi jihadists distinguish themselves from traditional Salafis, who they label sheikhs, so named because the jihadists believed that the sheikhists had forsaken adoration of God for adoration of the oil sheikhs of the Arabian Peninsula, with the Al Saud family at the head. Principal among the sheikh scholars was Abd al-Aziz ibn Baz, who is considered the archetypical court ulema, or the ulema al-Barat. These allegedly false Salafis had to be striven against and eliminated. But even more infuriating was the Muslim Brotherhood, whom the Salafi jihadists considered excessively moderate and lacking in a stricter literalist interpretation of the holy texts, the Quran and the Sunnah. Quietist Salafis criticize Al-Qaeda and Daesh, which is the Islamic State in Levant, as Kutubists. And according to them, these organizations are directly opposed to Salafiyya and its marhaj, or the methodology. Major doctrines of the Salafi jihadist movement have its roots in early heterodox sects such as the Kharijites. The Kharijites, also called the Al-Shurat, were an Islamic sect that appeared in the first century of Islam during the first Muslim civil war. Some members of the army of the fourth Caliph Ali seceded after he agreed to attribution with its rival. As a result, heavy creedal disparities exist between traditional Salafis and Salafi jihadists. Mainstream Salafism, which consists of both quietist and political Salafis, reject the violence of jihadists. Major Salafi scholars condemn many Salafi jihadist organizations, such as the Kharijites. The origins of Salafi jihadists can be traced back to the Egyptian Islamic movements of the 1950s, which are generally considered to be the precursors of contemporary Salafi jihadist movements. The theological doctrines of the Syrian Egyptian Islamic scholar Sayyid Rashid Rida greatly influenced these movements. Amongst his notable ideas included reviving the traditions of the early Muslim generations, which are called the Salaf, as well as ridding the Islamic world of Western influences and Jalaliya by specifically looking up to the model of Khalifa Rashidun. Rida's ideas would set the foundations of future Salafi jihadist movements and greatly influence Islamists like Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, Sayyid Qutb, and other Islamic fundamentalist figures like Sheikh Omar Abdul Rahman of the Gamma Islamiyya, Muhammad ibn al-Faraj of the Al-Jihad, or the Egyptian Islamic movement, Dr. Ayman al-Swahari of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, Sayyid Imam al-Sharif of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, and others. Forerunners of Salafi Jihadism principally includes Egyptian militant Islamic scholar and theoretician Sayyid Qutb, who developed the intellectual underpinnings in the 1950s for what would later become the doctrine of most jihadist organizations around the world, including Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Boko Haram, Abu Sayyaf, Jaish Muhammad. Sayyid Qutb's brother Muhammad Qutb was one of Osama bin Laden's teachers at university. And Qutb has been described as Al-Qaeda's philosopher. Dr. Ayman al-Swahari, the Egyptian who was second in command and co-founder of Al-Qaeda, calls Qutb the most prominent theoretician in the fundamentalist movement of all time. In his writings before and after joining the Muslim Brotherhood, Qutb argued that the Muslim world had reached a crisis point and that the Islamic world has been replaced by pagan ignorance of Jahiliyyah. When Qutb went abroad to the United States for 2 years, it is said he came back with extremist radical beliefs. He used what's been often described by scholars as his genuine literary excellence to spread these views of Western criticism to form the main intellectual doctrine for the Muslim Brotherhood, which later be adopted by most terrorist organizations worldwide. Qutbism, doctrine of Islam interpretation, emphasizes how the secular infidel Muslim leaders and populations have fallen to imitating the Western way of life, and that before any prosperity would occur, the Muslim must revert to the caliphate age of Sharia law instead of man-made laws. He issued ideological and religious debates stating that the violent means are justifiable under Islamic law for an end as great as returning the Islamic State days of glory, and that these means often lead a victorious, violent, holy war or jihad against the West. A part of his writings, which have influenced Islamists and terrorist organizations on the nature of the West, can be found in his book, The America That I Have Seen, which he wrote immediately after returning to Egypt from the United States. In it, he complained of Western materialism, individual freedoms, economic system, racism, brutal boxing matches, poor haircuts, and superficially in conversations and friendships. The crushing defeat of various Arab states in the 1967 Six-Day War, which led to the delegitimization of socialist and nationalist ideologies across the Arab world, which was the prominent ideology at the time, Pan-Arabism, often exalted by former Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, in which in 1952, the United States and Great Britain had written a doctoral discussion about the problems of Arab nationalism, which they saw as a threat to the First World in regards to the Arab world controlling the oil market. The nationalist ideology's demise provided a fertile ground for the Salafi movement, which spread across the Arab world as well as the wider Islamic world. The rise of the oil industry in Gulf states also brought in large workforce. The workforce embraced the Salafi doctrines and founded Salafi organizations as they returned to their home countries, because Saudi Arabia is the foundation for the Wahhabi movement, or the ideology founded under the noted Islamic preacher and theologian Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. Beginning from the 1970s, various Islamist and jihadist factions attempted to idealize traditional Salafi, recasting it as a totalizing political system based on the doctrines of Sayyid Qutb. And a majority of Salafis traditionally viewed Salafiyya as a scholarly movement that revived the religious faith of Muslims through teaching and devout adherence to Islamic decrees, as well as the Gulf oil boom and the Saudi imams and the preachers and the millionaire donors who funded this ideology throughout the madrasas worldwide. Additionally, they advocated Salafism to remain uncontaminated from politics. However, a minority sought the establishment of an Islamic system through violent means, based on Qutb's concepts of Hakamiyya, or the sovereignty of God. They advocated a global jihad with clear political overtones to fight for Muslim liberation across national boundaries. This movement came to be known as Salafi Jihadism. The expansion of Salafi jihadist groups grew from 1988 to 2013 exponentially tenfold. Gilles Kepel is a French political scientist and Arabist specialized in contemporary Middle East and Muslims in the West. And he writes that the Salafis, whom he encountered in Europe in the 1980s, were totally apolitical. However, by the mid-1990s, he had met some who felt jihad in the form of violence and terrorism was justified to realize their political objectives. The mingling of many Salafists who were alienated from mainstream European society with violent jihadists create a volatile mixture. And he went on to say, when you're in a state of such alienation, you become easy prey to the jihadi guys who will feed you more savory propaganda than the old propaganda of the Salafists who tell you to pray, fast, and who are not taking action. This ideology would be permeated after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. And of course, through the ideological works of the famed Sunni Islamic scholar and theologian Abdullah Yusuf Azam, who preached that defensive jihad by Muslims to help the Afghan Mujahideen against the Soviet invaders. Azam, who also broadened the idea of jihad, defensive jihad, preached that the transcendent in importance, 1 hour in the path of jihad is worth more than 70 years of praying at home. And this had global significance, in which he said, if a piece of Muslim land the size of a hand span is infringed upon, then jihad becomes fard, a personal obligation, on every Muslim, male and female, where the child shall march forward without the permission of its parents and the wife, without the permission of the husband. The expansion in Afghanistan, purported by the Taliban, who are part of the Deobandi, which is an Islamic revivalist movement within Sunni Islam that formed during the late 19th century around Darul Uloon Islamic Seminary in the town of Deobandi, India, from which the name derives. They are not Salafi. School of Islam, but cross-fertilized with bin Laden and other Salafi jihadists. And of course, they adhere to the Deobandi practices, which far predate Islam in its own right. And later, these would give rise to groups such as the Jamiat Alami-Hind, the Tablighi Jamaat, the Taliban, and of course the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan. Seth Jones of the Rand Corporation finds in his research that Salafi jihadist numbers and activity have increased between 2007 to 2013. Attacks by Al-Qaeda affiliated groups such as the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, Al-Shabaab, the Jabhat al-Nusra, and the Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, the largest Al-Qaeda group in existence right now. And despite Al-Qaeda's traditional focus on the far enemy, which is the United States and Europe, approximately 99% of the attacks by Al-Qaeda and its affiliates in 2013 were against near enemy targets, such as North Africa, Middle East, and other regions. This gave rise to the near enemy and far enemy approach, which is often adhered to Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri. But the original author and writer of the near enemy, far enemy approach is Muhammad ibn al-Faraj. In which he speaks about the jihadis of the near enemy, which are the apostates. The near enemy are the apostate regimes in and around the Middle East, in which he also credited the far enemy, which is the United States and the West. Now, Muhammad ibn al-Faraj, who wrote the document, which is based upon, of course, the works of Sayyid Qutb. Sayyid Qutb ideology had given Muhammad al-Salam Faraj the document, the rise of the document called the neglected obligation or the neglected duty, in which Faraj writes regarding the near enemy and far enemy approach. That the reasoning for the assassination of Egyptian President Anwar Sadat was that the government, along with all Muslim majority country governments, did not rule by the Sharia, and in which he adopted Qutb's ideology to spread the rise of the caliphate, in which they had to overtake these secular governments, these secular Arab governments, and replace them with Islamic ones. And when the caliphate is truly constructed according to the basis of the Quran and the Sunnah, then they could fight against the foreign of the United States and Israel. I think this is an important concept to talk about, because this ideology is what has given rise to the Salafi Jihadists that we've seen after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, in which Osama bin Laden and Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri and Sayyid Imam al-Sharif, who rushed the idea of the Muslim caliphate to fight against the far enemy approach, in which they did not have the backing of the Muslim caliphate, which would have taken decades upon decades to achieve, and they did not have the time. Sayyid Imam al-Sharif, or otherwise known as Dr. Fadl, is described as one of the major figures in the global jihadi movement. His book, Al-Umda al-Sirad al-Udi, or The Essentials of Making Ready for Jihad, was used as a jihadi manual in Al-Qaeda training camps in Afghanistan. And he's also one of the first members of the Al-Qaeda's top council. His work, The Essential Guide for Preparation, appeared in 1988 and became one of the most important texts of the jihadis training, which would later give rise to groups like the Islamic State Levant, Jabhat al-Nusra, Boko Haram, Abu Sayyaf, in which Imam Sharif would write, "The guide begins with the premise that jihad is the natural state of Islam. Muslims must always be in conflict with non-believers," Fadl asserts, "resorting to peace only in moments of abject weakness, because jihad is, above all, a religious exercise. There are divine rewards to be gained. He who gives money for jihad will be compensated in heaven, but not as much as the person who acts. The greatest prize goes to the martyr. Every able-bodied believer is obligated to engage in jihad, since most Muslim countries are ruled by infidels who must be forcibly removed in order to bring about an Islamic state. The way to bring an end to the rulers' unbelief is armed rebellion. Some Arab governments regard the book as so dangerous that anyone caught with a copy was subject to arrest about this book." Later on, he would leave the Islamic Jihad, or the Egyptian Islamic Jihad. And in 2004, al-Sharif had criticized the jihadi movement and condemned his own work, claiming that his works have created the foundation for most of the Salafi jihadist organizations you have seen today. Groups such as the Abdul Azam Brigades of Saudi Arabia, Abu Sayyaf in the Philippines, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq. The Ansar al-Islam in Iraq, Ansar al-Sharia in Mali, Ansar al-Sharia in Tunisia, the Boko Haram in Nigeria, the Egyptian Islamic Jihad in Egypt, the Harakat Ansar al-Din in Mali, the Indian Mujahideen in India, Islamic Jihad Union in Uzbekistan, Jaish al-Islam in the Gaza Strip or in Egypt, the Jemaah Islamiyah in the Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and the Philippines, Jund al-Sham in Lebanon, Qatar, and Afghanistan, the Liwa al-Islam in Syria, the Liwa al-Tawhid in Syria, the Mujahideen Shura Council in the Gaza Strip, the Tawhid wal Jihad in Iraq, which later becomes the Islamic Jihad in Iraq, and the Islamic Jihad, the Islamic State Levant, and the Islamic State. The ruling strategy of the Salafi jihadists, among the jihadists establishing an uncompromising form of Sharia law, is a core value and goal, but strategies differ over how quickly this should be done. Observers such as the journalist Robert Worth have described jihadis as being torn between wanting to build a truly Islamic order gradually from the bottom up in order to avoid alienating non-jihadi Muslims, which was the desire of Osama bin Laden, and not wanting to wait for the creation of an Islamic state. He would later write, "You have to take a gradual approach with them when it comes to religious practices. You can't beat people for drinking alcohol when they don't even know the basics of how to pray. We have to first stop the great sins and then do more gradually to the lesser and lesser ones. Try to avoid enforcing Islamic punishments as much as possible unless you're forced to do so." Now that's coming from a jihadi veteran of Yemen, in which he describes its approach toward the local populations. And this is how Salafi jihadists spread their or propagate their ideologies within the more poverty-stricken areas of the Islamic world, such as Indonesia, Philippines, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen. The views on violence regarding the Salafi jihadists in recent years, in which the methodology has come to be associated with the jihad of extremist groups that advocate the killing of innocent civilians. The European Parliament, in a report commissioned in 2013, claimed that Wahhabi and Salafi jihadi groups are involved mainly via Saudi charities in the support and supply of arms to rebel groups around the world. Some Salafi scholars appear to support violent extremism. The Egyptian Salafi jihadist cleric Mahmoud Shabin appeared to be on a religious television channel calling for the deaths of main opposition figures such as Mohammed el-Baridi, a Nobel Peace Prize laureate, and former presidential candidate Hamdeen Shahabi. Some other Islamic groups, particularly among Sufis, have also complained about extremism among the Salafi. Traditional Salafis have rejected the use of violence by Salafi jihadis. The Saudi scholar Muhammad ibn al-Uthaymin considered suicide bombing to be unlawful. And the scholar Abdul Mushin al-Abad wrote a treatise entitled, according to which intellect and religion is suicide bombings and destruction considered jihad. Muhammad Nasruddin al-Abini stated that history repeats itself. Everybody claims that the Prophet is their role model. Our Prophet spent the first half of the message making dawah. He did not start it with jihad. The vast majorities of Salafis reject violence, viewing most Salafi jihadist groups as deviants and are amongst their most vehement critics. It has been noted that the Western association of Salafism with violence stems from writings through the prism of security studies that were published in the late 20th century and that continue to persist. This also demonizes Muslims as a whole. And of course, the ignorance of the legacy media and self-appointed experts within the right-wing think tanks from Washington, D.C., which is basically have given rise to prejudice and also the excuses to use military excursions and imperialism to former socialist Arab states that were once prosperous or are now destabilized and destroyed due to U.S. imperialism of these countries, in which give rise to these jihadist-Salafist organizations, which are being supported and funded by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Yet the United States, in their own hypocrisy, is allied with Saudi Arabia, as well as Pakistan and the Gulf. Now, who are the propagators of this ideology, of the Salafi Jihadist movement? One of them is Ibn Taymiyyah, who was a Sunni Islamic scholar, a theologian and philosopher, sometimes a controversial thinker and political figure, and is known for his diplomatic involvement with the Ikhandi ruler Ghazan Khan and for his involvement at the Battle of Maj al-Shafra, which ended the Mongol invasion of Levant. A member of the Hanbali school, Ibn Taymiyyah's iconoclastic views on widely accepted doctrines of his time, such as the veneration of saints and the visitation to the tomb shrines, made him unpopular with many scholars and rulers of the time. He has also become one of the most influential medieval writers in contemporary Islam, where his particular interpretations of the Quran and the Sunnah and his rejection of some aspects of classical Islamic traditions are believed to have had considerable influence on contemporary ultra-conservative movements such as Salafi Jihadism. But why is his influence so permeated throughout contemporary Islam or contemporary Salafism? A strong influence on Ibn Taymiyyah was the founder of the Hanbali school of Islamic jurisprudence, Ahmad bin Hanbal. Ibn Taymiyyah was trained at this school, and he had studied Ibn Hanbal's Musnad, which is a collection of hadith compiled by Hanbal, in great detail, having studied it over multiple times. His work was most influenced by the sayings and actions of the Salaf, which are the first three generations of Muslims. And this showed in his work where he would give preference to the Salaf over his contemporaries. The modern Salafi movement derives its name from this school of thought. Ibn Taymiyyah's notion of jihad is important. He was noted for his emphasis in which he put on the importance of jihad and for the careful and lengthy attention he gave to the questions of martyrdom in jihad, such as benefits and blessings to be had for martyrs in the afterlife. He asserted that martyrdom and eternal rewards and blessings, in which he wrote that it is in jihad that one can live and die in ultimate happiness, both in this world and in the hereafter. Abandoning it means losing entirely or particularly both kinds of happiness. He defined jihad as it comprehends all sorts of worship, whether inward or outward, including love for Allah, being sincere to him, relying on him, relinquishing one's soul and property for his sake, being patient and austere, and keeping remembrance of Almighty Allah. It includes what is done by physical power, what is done by the heart, what is done by the tongue, through calling it to the way of Allah by means of authoritative proofs and providing opinions, and what is done through management, industry, and wealth. It is allowed to fight people for not observing unambiguous and generally recognizing obligations and prohibitions until they undertake to perform the explicitly prescribed prayers, to pay zakat, which is a tax, to fast during the month of Ramadan, to make the pilgrimage of Mecca, and to avoid what is prohibited, such as marrying women in spite of legal impediments, eating impure things, acting unlawfully against the lives and properties of Muslims, and the like. It is obligatory to take the initiative in fighting those people as soon as the proper summons with the reasons for which they are fought has reached them. But if they first attack the Muslims, then fighting them is even more urgent, as we have mentioned when dealing with the fighting against the rebellious and aggressive bandits. He also condemned Sufism, the Druze, and Alawites. His influence on modern Islamism, in which various concepts within modern day Islamism can be attributed directly to Ibn Taymiyyah. His influence is noted by Yahya Mikot, who says that Ibn Taymiyyah has thus become a sort of forefather to Al-Qaeda. One reason for this was his categorizing the world into distinct territories, which are the domain of Islam, Dar al-Islam, where the rule is of Islam and Sharia law is enforced, and the domain of unbelief, the Dar al-Kufr, ruled by unbelievers, and the domain of war, which is Dar al-Harb, which is territory under the rule of unbelievers who are involved in an active or potential conflict with the domain of Islam. Ibn Taymiyyah also included a fourth when the Mongols, who he considered unbelievers, took control of the city of Mardin. The population included many Muslims, believing Mardin was neither the domain of Islam, as Islam was not legally applied with an armed force consisting of Muslims. A second concept is making a declaration of apostasy or takfir against a Muslim who does not obey Islam. But at the same time, Ibn Taymiyyah maintained that no one can question another's faith and curse them as based as one's own desire, because faith is defined by God and the Prophet. He said, rather than cursing or condemning them, an approach should be taken where they are educated about the religion. A further concept attributed to Ibn Taymiyyah is the duty to oppose and kill Muslim rulers who do not implement the revealed law of the Sharia. Ibn Taymiyyah's role in the Islamist movements of the 20th and 21st century have also been noted by the previous coordinator for counterterrorism at the United States Department of State, Daniel Benjamin, who labels the chapter on the history of modern Islamic movements in his book, The Age of Sacred Terror, as Ibn Taymiyyah and his children. Another strong proponent of today's Salafi jihadist is Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab. The label Wahhabi is not claimed by his followers, but rather employed in criticism. Wahhab was born to a family of jurists, and his early education consisted of learning a fairly standard curriculum of orthodox jurisprudence according to the Hanbali school of Islamic law. Despite his teachings being rejected and opposed by many of the most notable Sunni Muslim scholars of his period, including his own father and brother, Abd al-Wahhab charted a religio-political pact with Muhammad bin Saud to help him establish the Emirate of Diriyah, which was the first Saudi state, and which later became an alliance, a power-sharing agreement between their families, which continues to the present day in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. His influence on Salafism is as follows. The Wahhab movement, which is, of course, today known as Wahhabism, which is now Salafi Jihadism. The designation of his doctrine as Wahhabiyya, which actually derives from his father's name, Abd al-Wahhab. Many adherents consider the label Wahhabism as a derogatory term coined by the opponents of the school of thought, and prefer to be known as the Salafi Jihadist movement. Modern scholars of Islamic studies point out that Salafism is a term applied to several forms of puritanical Islam in various parts of the world, while Wahhabism refers to the specific Saudi school which is seen as the more strict form of Salafism. However, modern scholars remark that Ibn Abdul al-Wahhab's followers adopted the term Salafi as a self-designation much later. Indeed, his first followers denominated themselves as the al-Tawhid and al-Muhadun, the Unitarians, or those who affirm defend the unity of God, and were labeled Wahhabis by their opponents. According to Professor Abdullah Saeed, Ibn Abd al-Wahhab should be considered one of the precursors of the modern Salafi movement rather than a full-fledged Salafi, because his teachings predate modern Salafism. Nevertheless, the Wahhabi movement is considered by modern scholars the most influential expression of Salafism of the Islamist sort, both for its role in shaping, some might say creating, modern Islamism, and for disseminating Salafi ideas widely across the Muslim world. The doctrines of Ibn al-Wahhab was criticized by a number of Islamic scholars during his lifetime, accusing him of disregarding Islamic history, monuments, traditions, and the sanctity of Muslims' life. His critics were mainly ulama from his homeland, the Najd region of Central Arabia, which was directly affected by the growth of the Wahhabi movement, based in the cities of Basra, Mecca, and Medina. His ideas later would not bode well for the contemporary Muslims of today, because they got lumped in with the ideology of al-Wahhab, in which he condemns the practices of praying at the tomb of Muhammad, as well as the graves of saints, which is, of course, still practiced today by the groups such as the Islamic State and the Islamic State and the Levant, in which they blew up the temples of Southeast Asia, in Afghanistan and Iraq. They also destroyed many tombs belonging to Sufi influential thinkers of the past. Another proponent of the Salafi Jihadist movement is Sayyid Qutb, an Egyptian author, educator, and theorist who was also a revolutionary and a poet, and the leading member of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood during the 1950s and 60s. He's the author of 24 books, and 30 of his books were unpublished, mainly for different reasons. And a lot of his works were destroyed by the Egyptian state. His legacy, alongside notable Islamists like Hassan al-Banna and Ruhollah Khomeini, in which many people remember him as the Ayatollah Khomeini, the founder of the Islamic Republic of Iran and leader of the Iranian Revolutionary War, and Malwani Maududi, an Islamic scholar, Islamist ideologue. Qutb is considered one of the most influential Muslim thinkers or activists of the modern era, not only for his ideas, but also for what many see as martyr's death. To fellow militant Islamists across the world, Qutb's execution in a Muslim country symbolized the depths of depravity the governments of the Islamic world had sunk to, and condemned secular Islamic thinking. Within Egypt itself, the martyrdom of Qutb gave birth to a new generation of militant Islamists, calling for the implementation of the Sharia, such as I mentioned before, Muhammad Abd al-Salam Faraj and Omar Abdul Rahman and Dr. Ayman al-Swahari, as well as Sayyid Imam al-Sharif. According to authors Daniel Benjamin and Stephen Simon, It was Sayyid Qutb who fused together the core elements of modern Islamism, the Kharijites' takfir, and Ibn Taymiyyah's fatwas and policy prescriptions, Rashid Rida's Salafism, and Maudud's concept of the contemporary Jalaliya and Hassan al-Banna's political activism all into one. Majority of mainstream Egyptian Islamists today consider Qutb's ideas to be far too radical and out of step with the times. Still, his books remain popular among university students and are widely read, serving as symbols of political resistance. Qutb's written works are still widely available and have been translated into many Western languages. His best-known work is Malim fi Tariq, or Milestones. But the majority of Qutb's theory can be found in his Quranic commentary in the Shade of the Quran, in which this 30-volume work is noteworthy for its innovative method of interpretation, borrowing heavily from the literary analysis of Iman al-Kuli, while refraining some structural features of classic contemporary commentaries, for example, the practice of progressing from the first surah to the last. For Qutb, the Quran was seen as the final arbiter in all matters relating to faith, while his main goal in writing the book, the Shade of the Quran, was to restore the centrality of faith in the consciousness and imagination of Muslims, and to kindle a cognitive revolution that would bring about a political and social process that would lead to the renewal of the Islamic tradition. The influence of his work extends to the issues such as Westernization, modernization, and political reform, and the theory of inevitable ideological conflict between Islam and the West, or the clash of civilizations, the notion of transnational ummah, and the comprehensive application of jihad. Qutb's theoretical work on Islamic advocacy, social justice, and education has left a significant mark not only on the Muslim Brotherhood, but also Muslim scholars from all backgrounds, like the founder of the Syrian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, Mustafa al-Saiba, as well as the Indonesian Sunni scholar Hamka, and the Iraqi Shia scholar Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr. His influence on al-Qaeda was felt through his writing, his followers, and specifically to his brother Muhammad Qutb, who moved to Saudi Arabia following his release from prison in Egypt and became a professor of Islamic studies and edited, published, and promoted his brother Said's work. One of Muhammad Qutb's students was later an ardent follower, was Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri, who went on to become a member of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad and later a mentor to Osama bin Laden, and later became the Emir of al-Qaeda. Zawahiri first introduced to Qutb by his uncle and maternal family patriarch Mahfouz Azam, who was very close to Qutb throughout his life. Azam was Qutb's student, then protege, then personal lawyer and executor of his estate, and one of the last people to see Qutb before his execution. According to author Lawrence Wright, who interviewed Azam, young Azam al-Zawahiri heard again and again from his beloved uncle Mahfouz about the purity of Qutb's character and the torment he had endured in prison. Zawahiri paid homage to Qutb in his work called Nights Under the Prophet's Banner. Acclaiming Qutb, al-Zawahiri wrote, quote, Sayyid Qutb underscored the importance of Tawheed, monotheism, in Islam, and the battle between it and its enemies is, as its core, an ideological difference over the presence of the oneness of God. It is the issue of who has the power, God and his Sharia, or man-made materialistic laws. Although Qutb was oppressed and tortured by Nasser's regime, his influence on young Muslims was paramount. Qutb's message was and still is to believe in the oneness of God and the supremacy of the divine path. The message fanned the fire of Islamic revolution against the enemies of Islam at home and abroad. The chapters of his revolution are renewing one day after another. Osama bin Laden was also acquainted with Said's brother Muhammad Qutb, a close college friend of bin Laden's, Muhammad Jamal Khalifa, the brother-in-law of Osama bin Laden, told Lawrence Wright, that bin Laden regularly attended weekly public lectures by Muhammad Qutb at King Abdul Aziz University, that he and bin Laden both read Sayyid Qutb. He was the one who most affected our generation. While imprisoned in Yemen, Anwar al-Awlaki, who was a Yemeni-American imam, became influenced by the works of Qutb. He would read 150 to 200 pages a day of Qutb's works, describing himself during the course of his reading as so immersed with the author, I would feel Sayyid with me in my cell, speaking to me directly. These are the proponents of the ideology of Salafi Jihadism that is still permeated within the terrorist groups that we see today in Syria, Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan. The groups, all these groups, which are basically primarily funded, or at one time funded, by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which is primarily in its essence, partly of its essence, the foundation of Wahhabism under the influences of Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Hanbal, and Muhammad ibn al-Wahhab. And that is going to be the audio of today. Thank you for listening.